The dust had not yet settled when Elvira Langston hit the hard-packed earth of the Millhaven road, her carpetbag landing 3 feet to her left with a dull, defeated thud, and the stagecoach rolled on without so much as a backward glance from the driver. She sat there for a moment, stunned not by the fall. She had braced herself well enough when the driver's partner took her by the arm and announced that non-paying passengers rode no farther than the last town, but by the sheer, breathtaking humiliation of it. The year was 1873, and the territory of New Mexico baked under a September sun that had no mercy for the poor, the desperate, or the recently widowed. Elvira was, at that particular moment in her life, all three of those things. She was 26 years old with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins during the unceremonious ejection, with green eyes that were presently stinging not from tears but from the alkaline dust rising around her, and with exactly 11 cents in the small leather purse she wore on a cord beneath her blouse. She had spent the last of her money on a half-decent meal in Santa Fe, believing she could explain her situation to the driver once they were moving, and that perhaps human decency would carry her the remaining 40 miles to Millhaven, where her late husband's sister, a woman named Catherine Prout, had offered her a place to land. Human decency, it turned out, did not ride the Butterfield line in September of 1873. Elvira pushed herself up from the road, brushed the red dust from her dark traveling dress, and looked around. The road stretched in both directions through scrubland dotted with juniper and piñon pine. Behind her, perhaps 200 yards back, sat a small settlement, a general store, a livery, a saloon with a sun-bleached sign, and a modest white-painted building that might have been a boarding house or a church or both. There was a wide wooden porch running along the front of what appeared to be the largest building, and on that porch, leaning against one of the support posts with his arms folded and his hat tilted low against the afternoon glare, stood a man who had watched the entire thing. She knew he had watched because he was still watching now. Elvira picked up her carpetbag, squared her shoulders in the way her mother had taught her, spine straight, chin up, no matter what the world throws at you, and walked back toward the settlement. The man on the porch did not move as she approached. He was tall, she could see that much from a distance, with broad shoulders under a faded canvas work shirt and dark trousers tucked into worn leather boots. His hat was a battered wide-brim affair that had once been brown, and was now the color of everything else in New Mexico. He had a lean jaw darkened with several days of beard growth, and his eyes, when she got close enough to see them beneath the hat brim, were the deep, steady gray of a sky before a good hard rain. He looked to be perhaps 30, maybe 31, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that would never be called pretty but would always be called honest. "That was a poor piece of business," he said, when she reached the foot of the porch steps. "It was," Elvira agreed, because there was no sense pretending otherwise. He unfolded his arms and pushed off from the post. "Thomas Ellsworth," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I own this trading post." "Elvira Langston," she said. "I need to get to Millhaven." "So did the coach," he said, and there was a faint dry humor in it, not unkind. "Next one comes through Wednesday, that's 4 days from now." Elvira closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the land and the porch and Thomas Ellsworth were all still exactly where she had left them. "I see," she said. "What happened in there?" he asked, meaning the coach, nodding in the direction the vehicle had disappeared. "I did not have the fare," she said plainly. "There was no dignity in dressing it up. I had it when I boarded in Albuquerque. My purse was cut on the street before I could reach the station. By the time I understood what had happened, the coach was already moving, and I made the very poor decision to get on anyway and hope for the best." Thomas Ellsworth looked at her for a long, careful moment. Then he said something she had not expected at all. "Get back on," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The coach." He stepped down from the porch and reached for her carpetbag, which she instinctively pulled closer before realizing what he was doing. "I ride to Millhaven on Wednesday. I have business with the grain merchant there, and I take the stage when I go. You can ride with my fare until Millhaven." He paused. "I'll walk around to the driver before boarding and tell him you're with my party. They won't put you off a second time." Elvira stared at him. In her experience, generosity from a stranger in the West in 1873 came wrapped in complications she preferred not to untangle. She had been warned about this kind of offer. "I don't know you," she said carefully. "No," Thomas agreed. "That's true, and I'm not asking you to trust anything more than a 4-day wait and a 40-mile ride. My housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, lives behind the store and she runs a clean room for travelers. I'll pay your board until Wednesday. You can decide what you think of me by then." He said it so matter-of-factly, as though the problem were entirely ordinary and the solution entirely simple, that Elvira found herself off balance in a new way entirely. She had been braced for trouble. She had not been braced for straightforwardness. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Thomas Ellsworth looked out at the road where the dust cloud from the departing coach had gone completely flat and still. "Because you looked like you needed it," he said, "and because what that driver did was wrong." He turned back to her. "That's the whole of it, Mrs. Langston," she heard the missus, and understood that he had noticed the ring she still wore on her left hand, a thin gold band that she had not yet decided whether she would wear forever or put away. Her husband, Daniel Langston, had died of a fever in the spring. They had been married 3 years and the marriage had been kind and ordinary and not at all what she had once imagined love to be, but she had cared for him and the loss had hollowed her out in ways she was still discovering. "All right," she said at last. "Thank you, Mr. Ellsworth." He took her carpetbag before she could protest further, and she let him take it. The trading post was larger inside than it appeared from the road. It smelled of tobacco and dried herbs, and the particular combination of leather and iron that was the natural perfume of every general store west of the Mississippi. Shelves ran floor to ceiling along 2 walls, packed with canned goods and bolts of cloth and harness hardware and glass bottles of various sizes. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner, cold now in the September heat, with 2 mismatched chairs arranged beside it. A long wooden counter ran along the back, behind which a young Mexican boy of perhaps 14 was stacking tins of peaches with careful concentration. "That's Pedro," Thomas said. "He works for me in the afternoons." Pedro looked up and nodded with great seriousness. A door at the back of the store led to a small courtyard, and beyond it was a separate low adobe structure where Mrs. Delgado lived and kept 2 spare rooms for travelers. She was a compact, dark-eyed woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pinned at the nape of her neck, and an expression that suggested she had seen everything and been surprised by very little of it. She looked Elvira over with frank appraisal and then looked at Thomas. "She needs a room until Wednesday," Thomas said. "I can see that," Mrs. Delgado said. She held out a hand to Elvira. "Come, I'll show you the room. It's clean and the mattress is not terrible." It was, in fact, a very decent mattress, and the room had a small window that looked out on a garden where Mrs. Delgado grew tomatoes and dried chili peppers in long ropes along the wall. Elvira set her carpetbag down on the wooden chair beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and allowed herself, for the first time all day, to feel the full weight of how exhausted she was. She had left Santa Fe 3 days ago. Before that she had been in Albuquerque for 2 weeks, trying to settle what remained of Daniel's affairs. He had been a land surveyor and had died with more debts than assets, which had surprised her, though perhaps it should not have. Before Albuquerque there had been the long train journey from Missouri, and before Missouri there had been the dreadful months after the fever, the funeral, the condolences, the polite inquiries from Daniel's family about when she would be vacating the house they had been renting. She was tired in a way that sleep alone could not cure, but sleep was a start. She slept through the rest of the afternoon and woke to the sound of Mrs. Delgado calling her for supper. They ate in the small kitchen of the adobe house Elvira, Mrs. Delgado, and a quiet young woman named Rosa, who was Mrs. Delgado's niece and helped with the cooking. Thomas Ellsworth did not join them for supper, which Elvira noticed, and then told herself firmly was not a thing worth noticing. But the next morning he was at the counter when she came through the store to ask about purchasing some cornbread from Mrs. Delgado, and he poured her a cup of coffee from the pot that sat on the small burner behind the counter as naturally as if he had been expecting her. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in weeks," she said honestly. He nodded and slid the coffee toward her. It was strong and slightly bitter, and exactly what she needed. She stood at the counter and drank it and watched him work, checking inventory against a small ledger, making notes with a pencil stub, occasionally calling out to Pedro, who was already sweeping the front step. "How long have you been here?" she asked after a while. 7 years, he said without looking up from the ledger. "Came out from Tennessee in '66. Worked cattle for 2 years, then decided I preferred selling things to chasing them." He flipped a page. "You? Missouri," she said. "I've never been west of Missouri before this year." He did look up then. "What brought you all the way out here?" "My husband died," she said. "His sister is in Millhaven and she wrote to say I was welcome there. I had no other good options." Thomas Ellsworth said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Elvira said. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup and looked out through the store's front window at the road, which was empty and perfectly still in the early morning light. He was a good man, not a complicated man, but a good one. She did not know why she had added that qualifier except that it was true and she had not said it to anyone before, and it felt important somehow to say it to someone. Thomas did not press her further on it, which she found she appreciated. Over the next 2 days, a kind of easy rhythm established itself between them without either of them precisely deciding on it. Elvira, who had always been useful by nature and idle by disposition only under duress, began helping around the store in small ways, organizing a shelf that had gotten disordered, wrapping purchases for customers, translating once for a Mexican rancher who spoke no English and whose Spanish she had explained apologetically to Thomas. She had only from 2 years of a finishing school course and was therefore probably full of errors. Thomas had looked at her with evident surprise, and then had listened to the halting exchange with what might have been admiration. "Where did you learn Spanish?" he asked afterward. "St. Louis," she said. "I had a very thorough education for absolutely no practical purpose." She paused. "Until now, I suppose," he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, a low, genuine sound that transformed his face entirely, made the weathered lines of it open up into something almost boyish. She felt something shift very slightly in her chest, and told herself it was relief at having made someone laugh in what had been a very long season of not making anyone laugh. On the second afternoon, a group of cowboys came through, 3 men riding north from a ranch somewhere below, dusty and loud in the way of men who have been on the trail for several days, and are glad to see a roof and a counter. They bought tobacco and jerky and a bottle of whiskey, which Thomas sold them with the frank reminder that they were to drink it outside the store and not on the premises. 2 of the cowboys were unremarkable. The third, a young man with a reddish beard and an overly familiar manner, turned his attention to Elvira in a way that made her spine tighten. "Well, what have we here?" the young man said, leaning on the counter with a grin that he clearly considered charming. "You work here, sweetheart." "I'm a guest," Elvira said, and returned her attention to the bolt of calico she had been helping Mrs. Delgado measure. "A guest," the young man repeated. "Fancy that, in a place like this." Thomas set the bottle of whiskey on the counter with a sound that was just slightly more deliberate than necessary. "That'll be $1.45, he said, looking directly at the young man. His voice was even, but there was something behind it that was not quite a warning and was not quite not one. The young man looked at Thomas, then back at Elvira, then at Thomas again. He made some internal calculation that apparently resulted in the decision to pick up his bottle and leave because that was what he did. His companions followed him out and the bell above the door jingled in their wake. Thomas said nothing. He picked up his ledger and went back to his numbers. Elvira watched him for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. He glanced up. For what? You know for what, she said. He went back to the ledger and she thought she saw, beneath the brim of that battered hat, the suggestion of a half-smile. That evening after Mrs. Delgado had retired and Rosa had gone home to her own family 2 streets over, Elvira found Thomas sitting on the front porch in one of the wooden rocking chairs, looking out at the road in the last light. The sky to the west was doing extraordinary things, deep orange fading to violet, the kind of sunset that seemed almost exaggerated, too theatrical to be real. A person could live their whole life in Missouri, Elvira thought, and never see a sky like that. She came out with 2 cups of coffee and he accepted one without remark, as though she had been sitting with him on that porch for years. They were quiet for a while. The road was empty. Somewhere behind the store a coyote called once and was answered from a great distance. "Can I ask you something?" Elvira said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "I might not answer." She smiled a little. "What made you say it when I was standing in the road? You said get back on. You didn't know me. You didn't know what had happened or why." Thomas was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in both hands. "I know what it looks like," he said at last, "when a person is at the end of their rope and still holding on anyway." He paused. "You were covered in road dust, and you'd just been thrown off a stagecoach in front of a stranger, and you still stood up and straightened your back before you walked this way." He shook his head slightly. "Something like that deserves a hand up, not a looking away." Elvira felt the words settle somewhere deep inside her, not as compliments, though they were something like that, but as the particular sensation of being accurately seen by another person, which was rarer and more valuable than beauty or praise. "You're a good man, Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she repeated. There was a silence that was different from the earlier silences, warmer and more complicated, and neither of them moved to end it quickly. "Do you have family in Millhaven?" he asked after a time. "Apart from the sister-in-law?" "No," Elvira said. "I don't have much family anywhere, really. My parents are both gone. I have a brother in Ohio who I see very rarely. Daniel's family was kind, but—" she paused, searching for the right word. "They were kind in the way that people are kind when they've decided what you should do and they're being patient about waiting for you to do it." Thomas nodded slowly. "And Catherine Prout, you know her well." "I've met her twice," Elvira admitted. "She seemed like a sensible woman. Her husband runs a feed store." "I know it," Thomas said. "Prout's. It's a decent operation. He's a fair dealer." That made Elvira feel unexpectedly better that this quiet, careful man had a good opinion of the people she was traveling toward. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you have family?" "My mother is still living in Nashville," he said. "I write to her when I can. My father died in the war." He said this last part without particular inflection, the way men of his generation often said it, as something too large and too common to require commentary. "I'm sorry," Elvira said. "It was a long time ago," he said. "He was a good man, too." They sat with that for a moment, with the shared catalogue of good men who were gone, and the violet sky deepened to indigo above the scrubland, and the first stars came out over the mountains. Wednesday arrived the way all dreaded and anticipated things arrive, too soon in some ways and not soon enough in others, and with a morning that seemed entirely indifferent to human feeling, perfectly clear and blue and smelling of sage after a brief night rain. Elvira was ready before Thomas, which surprised her into a rueful private amusement. She sat on the porch with her carpetbag at her feet and watched the road, and tried to have a reasonable relationship with the fact that she would be leaving in a few hours, and that this was exactly what she had wanted and entirely as it should be. She heard him come through the store behind her, heard the bell jingle as he came out, and turned. He had put on a better shirt, white linen, carefully pressed, with a dark vest over it, and he had shaved, which changed his face again, making the lines of his jaw cleaner and somehow more vulnerable. He was carrying a leather satchel that held his business papers and had his hat in his other hand, which he put on as he stepped onto the porch. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she agreed. Mrs. Delgado came out behind him to see them off. She kissed Elvira on both cheeks, which Elvira had not expected and which moved her more than she would have anticipated. "You come back through here sometime," Mrs. Delgado said. "You're a good worker and you made my tomatoes look nice." Elvira laughed. "Thank you for everything." Pedro was at the gate of the courtyard, solemn as always, holding the reins of the horse Thomas would use to ride to the stage station down the road. Thomas shook the boy's hand like an equal and told him to keep the inventory ledger updated and not to let anyone take credit who hadn't established it already. Pedro nodded with the gravitas of a man accepting command of a fortress. The stage station was a quarter-mile east, a low adobe building with a corral beside it. The Butterfield coach stood outside it, the driver already up on the box, his partner loading the last of the mail bags. There were 3 other passengers gathering: a preacher in a black coat who kept fussing with his collar, a heavy-set merchant who was sweating already, and a young Mexican woman traveling with an infant strapped to her chest, who stood apart from the others with the particular self-containment of a person accustomed to not being welcomed into the general gathering. Thomas tied his horse at the corral and went directly to the driver as he had promised. Elvira stood back and watched him speak. He was unhurried and direct, one hand resting on the wheel of the coach. She saw the driver nod and say something back, and Thomas said something further, and then the driver nodded again with a different expression, and that appeared to be the end of it. Thomas walked back to her. "It's settled," he said simply. "You're on the manifest as part of my party." "What did you tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Thomas said. "That you had your money stolen, and it was a shameful piece of business to have put you off on the road, and that you were my guest for the remainder of the journey." He accepted that. "He didn't have a great many choices," Thomas said mildly, and she got the impression, not for the first time, that Thomas Ellsworth was a man who carried a certain quiet authority that had nothing to do with volume or threat, and everything to do with the particular solidity of someone who had decided what he believed and did not spend energy second-guessing it. The inside of the coach was close and warm with 5 passengers, the infant, and the various packages and bags of everyone involved. Thomas sat across from Elvira, which meant she spent the first 20 miles of the journey looking at his boots, and then his hands, and then out the window, and then back to his hands, which were broad and were cruffined and folded easily over his knee. He pulled a book from his satchel. She caught the spine. It was a worn copy of David Copperfield, and read with the easy absorption of a man genuinely accustomed to reading for pleasure, which struck her as the most interesting thing she had yet learned about him. The preacher attempted conversation with the merchant. The merchant was more interested in sleeping. The young Mexican woman, whose name Elvira eventually learned was Marta, smiled at Elvira over the head of her sleeping infant with the wordless solidarity of a shared situation. After about an hour, the coach hit a stretch of particularly rough road, and everyone was jostled significantly. The merchant made a sound like a disgruntled bear. The infant woke and began to cry. Thomas looked up from his book, assessed the situation, closed his book, and said something in Spanish to Marta that Elvira followed well enough to understand, was an offer to take the baby for a few minutes while Marta resettled herself. Marta looked startled, clearly not expecting this, and then handed the infant over with visible relief. Thomas held the baby with the comfortable competence of a person who had held babies before. The infant, who had been howling with impressive commitment, blinked up at the unfamiliar face and hiccuped to silence. Elvira watched this happen and felt something in her chest do a small and inconvenient thing that she did not immediately find a good name for. "You've done that before," she said. "I have 3 younger siblings," he said, looking down at the baby, who was now studying his vest button with focused interest. "2 sisters and a brother. I was the eldest." "I could tell," Elvira said. He looked up from the baby and met her eyes, and for a moment the swaying coach and the snoring merchant and the preacher's monologue all went slightly distant and unimportant. Marta reclaimed her infant shortly after. Thomas reopened his book. Elvira looked out the window at the New Mexico landscape rolling past, the scrubland giving way in places to wide flats of pale grass, the mountains to the north constant and blue and enormous, and thought about Thomas Ellsworth with the helpless concentration of a woman who has decided not to think about something, and has thereby guaranteed she will think of almost nothing else. It was not, she told herself with some firmness, sensible. She was going to Millhaven. He was going to Millhaven for a day, perhaps two, and then returning to his trading post. She was a widow of 6 months who was traveling on charity to a woman she barely knew with 11 cents and a carpetbag. This was not the moment for whatever this was. And yet the road to Millhaven was 40 miles and the coach was slow, and the afternoon light was golden through the window glass. And Thomas Ellsworth had twice looked up from his book and caught her looking at him, and each time had said nothing, and looked back down with something careful and quiet in his expression that she suspected mirrored exactly what she could feel in her own. Millhaven was not a large town, but it was a prosperous one, built along a wide main street with wooden boardwalks and solid brick buildings at its center. A courthouse was under construction at the northern end, scaffolding, and the sound of hammering carrying down the street. There was a bank, 2 hotels, a doctor's office, the grain merchant Thomas was visiting, and 3 blocks down on a side street, Pruett's feed store, the sign of which Elvira spotted from the coach window as they came in. She felt Thomas watching her notice it. "Your destination," he said. "Yes," she agreed. She felt a peculiar fluttering in her stomach that was not quite anticipation and not quite dread, but had something of both. The coach stopped at the station on Main Street. Thomas helped her down before the driver's partner could get to the door, and stood with her on the boardwalk, while the other passengers collected themselves and dispersed. Marta nodded to her warmly as she left, the infant now asleep against her chest. "I'll walk you to Pruett's," Thomas said. She did not argue. The feed store was exactly what it sounded like, a large wooden building that smelled of grain and hay, with sacks piled high along the walls and a young man loading a wagon out front. At the counter inside stood a solid-looking man in his 40s with a brown beard going to gray, and beside him, having apparently been in conversation with him when they arrived, was Catherine Pruitt. Catherine Pruitt was a tall woman, raw-boned and direct, with Elvira's late husband's coloring, the brown eyes and the strong jaw in a feminine version. She was perhaps 40 and carried herself like a woman who was accustomed to getting things done and expected others to do the same. She looked at Elvira and then at Thomas and then back at Elvira and said, "You're here. I was expecting you Tuesday." "There was a complication," Elvira said. "This is Mr. Thomas Ellsworth. He runs the trading post at Dry Creek Station. I had some difficulty on the road and he was kind enough to help." Catherine Pruitt looked at Thomas with the frank appraisal that seemed to be a family trait. "What kind of difficulty?" "I was removed from the coach for not having the fare," Elvira said. "My money was stolen in Santa Fe." Catherine's expression went through several things quickly. Removed from the Butterfield driver put a woman off on the road. "He did," Thomas said. "It was not well done." Catherine looked at him again with what seemed like revised estimation. "No," she said, "it was not." She turned to her husband. "Will, this is Elvira, Daniel's wife." She corrected herself. "Daniel's widow." Will Pruitt put out a large hand and shook Elvira's with a warmth that surprised her. "We're glad you're here," he said, and meant it visibly. "Catherine's been setting up the spare room since your letter." Something in Elvira's chest unknotted, slowly and with some effort, like a fist that has been clenched for a very long time. She turned to Thomas. He was standing slightly back, hat in hand, watching this small reunion with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, the room at Mrs. Delgado's, the fare, the walking me here." "It was no trouble," he said, which was what a person said when they meant something more complicated than that, she had come to understand. Are you in town long?" she asked, and regretted immediately how much she could hear in her own voice. 2 days, he said. "I have business at Morrison's Grain on Thursday morning, and then I'll likely head back Friday." I see, she said. There was a pause in which both of them stood in the dusty light of Prout's feed store with about 4 feet of air between them and a very large number of unspoken things in that air. Perhaps you'd allow me to take supper with the Prouts tomorrow evening, Thomas said then, in the careful, measured way of a man who has thought about saying something and then said it anyway, as a proper farewell. If that would be agreeable to Mrs. Prout. Catherine Prout, who had been conspicuously organizing a stack of receipts on the counter, said without looking up, it would be entirely agreeable to Mrs. Prout. Something passed across Thomas's face that Elvira thought might have been relief. Then I'll come at 6, he said, if that suits. It suits, Elvira said. He put his hat back on, said goodbye to the Prouts, and left. Elvira stood for a moment and then became aware that Catherine was watching her with the expression of a woman who notices things. Come, Catherine said. Let me show you your room, and then you can tell me about this Mr. Ellsworth and the trading post and the complication, all of which I feel have more to them than 30 seconds of explanation. Elvira laughed despite herself. You're very much like your brother, she said. Catherine looked at her with something softer then. I know, she said. I miss him too. The room Catherine had prepared was comfortable and bright, with a calico quilt and a view of the small garden behind the house. Elvira unpacked her carpetbag for the first time since Santa Fe. There was not much in it, but having her few things in drawers and on a shelf made the room feel like something she could, cautiously, inhabit. Catherine brought her tea and sat in the armchair in the corner while Elvira told the story from the beginning. The pickpocket in Santa Fe, the coach, the road, the trading post, Thomas. Catherine listened without interrupting, which was a gift, and when Elvira finished, Catherine was quiet for a moment. He paid your board for 4 days and your fare without being asked, Catherine said slowly, and then walked you here from the station. Yes, Elvira said, and he's coming to supper tomorrow. Yes. Catherine drank her tea. How old is he? 30, I think, perhaps 31. And you're 26. Catherine set down her cup with the finality of someone closing a book at a satisfying page. Good, she said. Catherine, Elvira said. You're a young widow with a good head and a kind heart, Catherine said, and you've been grieving for 6 months, and before that you were nursing Daniel through his illness, and before that she paused carefully. Daniel was a good man, but I watched you with him. You were devoted, you were careful. I'm not sure you were ever, she stopped again. Happy, Elvira supplied quietly. Lit up, Catherine said. You never looked lit up. Elvira looked at the calico quilt. I cared for him, she said. I know you did, Catherine said. That's different. That's not what I'm talking about. There was a silence. Through the window, the sounds of Millhaven's Thursday afternoon went on without them, the hammer on the courthouse, a wagon going past, a dog somewhere. He's probably just kind, Elvira said. Probably, Catherine agreed, in a tone that suggested she thought nothing of the sort. Thomas came to supper the next evening at 6 exactly, in the white linen shirt and dark vest, which he had apparently taken the trouble to have pressed. He brought a bottle of wine from the hotel stock, which impressed Will Prout, who was not easily impressed, and a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that he gave to Elvira at the door with the particular kind of formality that people used when they were doing something that mattered to them, and were trying not to let it show too obviously. Supper was venison stew that Catherine had been working on most of the afternoon, with cornbread and roasted corn on the side. They ate at the round table in the kitchen, which was warm from the stove and smelled of thyme and wood smoke. Will told a story about a recent acquisition gone wrong at the feed store that was funnier in the telling than it had probably been in the living. Catherine argued with him good-naturedly about the details. Thomas contributed a story from the trading post about a man who had once tried to trade a mule that was, as it later emerged, not his mule, which made everyone laugh. And Elvira found herself laughing in a way she had not laughed in months, from the stomach, without thinking about it first. She caught Thomas looking at her when she laughed. He did not look away when she caught him. After supper, Will and Catherine excused themselves with the elaborate casualness of a married couple coordinating without words, and Elvira and Thomas found themselves in the small sitting room with coffee cups and a fire that Will had built before disappearing in the September evening's chill. "You leave tomorrow," Elvira said. "In the afternoon," Thomas said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She had noticed this habit, this thing he did when he was choosing words. "I want to ask you something, Mrs. Langston." "Elvira." "Ask it," she said. "Do you plan to stay in Millhaven long?" She considered. "I don't have anywhere else particular to go," she said honestly. "Catherine is kind. Will seems decent. I'll need to find work. I can teach probably. I had a good education, and Mrs. Prout mentioned that there's been talk of a proper school here for some time. Or I can help in the store. I don't know yet." "What do you want?" Thomas asked. "Not what's practical. What do you want?" The directness of the question startled her. People had been asking her what she planned and what she intended and what was reasonable, and no one had asked her what she wanted. She looked at the fire for a moment. "I want to be somewhere that feels real," she said slowly. "I want work that means something. I want to wake up in the morning and have something that is genuinely mine." She paused. "I know that's not very specific." "It's specific enough," Thomas said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, and if it's too soon or unwelcome you can tell me so and I will not press it." "Say it," she said. "I have been thinking about you since the first moment you stood up out of the road and set your back straight," he said. "I have been thinking about you considerably more since the last 4 days, and I suspect I will go on thinking about you whether I say this or not. So I am saying it." He met her eyes directly. "I would like to know you better. I would like you to come back to Dry Creek when you've settled what you need to settle here, and I would like to take you for a proper ride and show you the country properly, not from a stagecoach window. And if you find after that you have no interest in further acquaintance, I will drive you back to Millhaven myself and trouble you no more." Elvira's heart was doing something quite unreasonable in her chest. She felt warm from the fire and from something that was not the fire, and she thought about what Catherine had said, not happy, lit up, and decided that she was presently finding out exactly what that distinction meant. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "I am still wearing my ring," she said carefully, "and it has been 6 months and I have not stopped grieving. I want you to know that. I think you deserve to know that." "I know it," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop anything. I'm asking if I can write to you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, you can write to me." He left the following afternoon as he had said. He shook Will's hand and thanked Catherine with genuine warmth, and then turned to Elvira at the door of the Prout house, with his hat in his hand and the autumn sun behind him. "I'll write," he said. "I'll write back," she said. He put his hat on, picked up his satchel, and walked down the street toward the stage station. She watched him go until the distance made him too small to distinguish from the other figures on the boardwalk, and then she went inside and sat in the parlor chair and put her hands in her lap and stared at nothing for a while. "Well," said Catherine, appearing in the doorway with a dish towel, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "Stop it," Elvira said, but she was smiling. The first letter from Thomas arrived 10 days later, written in a precise and careful hand on store letterhead. It told her that the ride back had been uneventful, that Pedro had managed the store admirably in his absence, that the grain purchase from Morrison's had gone through at a fair price, and that he hoped she had settled well in Millhaven. He had added at the bottom, almost as though it were an afterthought, "The evenings seem longer than they did before." Elvira read that last line 4 times and then wrote back at once 7 pages, which she regarded with some concern, before deciding they were a reasonable representation of what she actually wanted to say. She told him about Millhaven, about the progress on the courthouse which she could hear from Catherine's kitchen, about the prospect of the schoolteacher position which was becoming more real. There had been a meeting of the town council, and her name had been put forward by Catherine with characteristic Prout directness. She told him about the town's small injustices as she observed them, the Mexican families who lived on the less prosperous end of town, and whose children did not always have access to the same resources as the Anglo families, which bothered her considerably, and which she intended to address if she got the schoolteacher position, because a schoolroom should be open to every child who wanted to learn regardless of their parents' origin. She wrote, "I don't know if you'll agree with me on that. I hope you will. But even if you don't, I find I am someone who has to say it plainly." His reply to that particular section came back equally plainly. "I agree with you entirely. The children of the ranchers who supply me and the children of the Mexican workers who work for those ranchers are equally good and equally deserving. Anyone who says otherwise is either ignorant or dishonest, and you should run your schoolroom exactly as your conscience demands." She read that letter standing at the counter in the Prout kitchen, while Catherine pretended to be interested in the window. She wrote back within the hour. She got the schoolteacher position in October. The town council, 5 men, all Anglo, all with opinions, had interviewed her with the polite skepticism reserved for women who wanted things they were technically entitled to and practically expected to politely forego. Elvira had been extremely pleasant, answered every question with precise accuracy, and at the end of the interview had said straightforwardly that she intended to teach every child in Millhaven who wished to learn, regardless of background, and that this was not a point she was open to negotiation on. There was a long silence. Then the council chairman, a man named Garrett who was either brave or simply resigned, said, "Approved." She wrote to Thomas that same evening with the news, and his reply, which was becoming remarkably faster than the delivery time should theoretically allow, which meant he was writing back the same day her letters arrived, said simply, "Of course you did. There was never any doubt in my mind." She folded that letter very carefully and kept it in the box she had begun keeping in the drawer of her nightstand. The school was a single large room at the south end of Main Street with a pot-bellied stove, 15 wooden desks, and a chalkboard that needed replacing. Elvira replaced it with the first month of her salary, which was not large but was hers, which made it feel considerable. Her first day she had 9 students. By the third week she had 14, including 4 children whose families had been quietly told by various sources that they might not be welcome. Elvira had personally called at 3 of those families' homes to say they were welcome, which produced some raised eyebrows in town, and at least one complaint to Will Prout, who listened to the complaint with the patience of a man who knows his wife has already decided how this is going to go. She wrote to Thomas about this, and he wrote back with a long letter that included the observation that the best teachers he had ever known were the ones who understood that education was not a privilege to be allocated but a tool to be distributed as widely as possible, and that she was clearly that kind of teacher. He also mentioned that he had finally found a solution to the inventory problem Pedro kept encountering with the bulk goods, and that the autumn had been particularly beautiful this year, and that Mrs. Delgado had made a tamale that was so good it required immediate reporting. The letters had, without either of them formally acknowledging it, become the primary way each of them thought about the world. Elvira had begun to notice that when she encountered something interesting or beautiful or troubling, her first impulse was to file it away to tell Thomas. She thought this was probably significant. He came to Millhaven in November for the grain quarter sale at Morrison's, which happened 4 times a year, and which she now knew was the rhythm of their geography. He arrived on a Tuesday, came directly to the school, and stood in the doorway during the last half hour of the day's lessons with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that she felt across the room. She did not stop teaching because her students were in the middle of a long division problem, and long division waits for no one. But she was aware of him standing there with a clarity that was not at all compatible with arithmetic. After the last student had gone, he came fully into the room. She was erasing the chalkboard, and he stood in the middle of the room, looking at the desks and the globe on the corner shelf, and the careful alphabet she had painted above the board in both English and Spanish. "You put it in both languages," he said. Every child here deserves to see their language on the wall, she said. He was quiet for a moment. May I take you for that ride, he said. Tomorrow, if you're free. There's a ridge about 3 miles north I've been meaning to show you since October. I'm free tomorrow afternoon, she said. The horses were from the livery, a solid bay for him and a gentle roan for her, and they rode north through the scrubland in the clear, cold November air with the mountains turning blue and white at their tops, and the whole country laid out around them like something that had decided to be beautiful on purpose. Thomas knew the land the way people knew language they had learned young, instinctively, without effort, pointing out a hawk circling to the east, identifying a particular formation of rock that he said was called something by the local Navajo people whose territory this had been, and whose displacement he mentioned with a quiet gravity that she noted and appreciated. "It's a wrong thing," he said simply. "The displacement. Most of the wrong things out here are the same wrong things happening to different people in different shapes, and not enough people say so." "You say so," she said. "Not loudly enough," he said. She thought about that for a long time. The ridge, when they reached it, was exactly what he had promised. A long shelf of red sandstone looking west over a wide valley, with the afternoon sun turning everything gold and the shadows of the juniper trees going long and blue across the ground. They stood at the edge of it with the horses ground-hitched behind them and the wind coming in from the southwest, and Elvira thought that this was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen in her 26 years, and that she was standing in it next to a man she was rapidly running out of good arguments against loving. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said, looking out at the valley. "I took off my ring last week," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I put it in my box with your letters," she said, "which is probably a strange thing to tell you, but I am telling you anyway." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "It's not strange. I love Daniel," she said. "I need you to know that, not the way you might imagine, but he was good to me and I was good to him, and I'm not setting that aside. I'm just also," she stopped. "What?" he said gently. "Also this," she said. She turned to face him fully. "Also standing on this ridge with you, and being unable to think about anything but the fact that I have been waiting to see you for 6 weeks, and I had things I needed to say before I said that." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached out and took her hand, both of them still in their riding gloves, and held it with the quiet steadiness that was the most characteristic thing about him. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a Thomas Ellsworth gesture, which was the same as saying it was entirely honest. "I've been in love with you since you stood up out of the road," he said. "I've been trying to move at a pace that was decent and respectful, and I have been finding it very difficult." She laughed, the same stomach laugh as the supper table, the one she couldn't manage to think about first. "Move faster," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed the back of it over the leather of the glove, and then he raised his eyes to hers, and the look in them was so warm and direct and unguarded that she felt it go all the way through her. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With all the visiting and writing and all the parts in between. You've been courting me for 2 months, she said. "Then I would like to continue to court you," he said, "and when it's right, ask you to marry me." Elvira looked at him in the golden November light on the red sandstone ridge above the valley. "When it's right," she agreed. "Yes." He kept her hand for the whole ride back to Millhaven, which was not entirely practical on horseback and was entirely wonderful. The courtship, by the standards of 1873 New Mexico territory, was conducted with remarkable diligence given the 40 miles between them. Thomas came to Millhaven every month when the grain sale brought him, and once in December for no commercially discernible reason, which Will Prout noticed and said nothing about, and which Catherine noticed and said entirely too much about in the privacy of the kitchen. They rode together when he came. They had supper at the Prout table, which had expanded naturally to include Thomas in the way that good tables do, absorbing new people without effort. He met her students at a school Christmas party she organized in December, at which 6 of the children performed a short recitation, and one 7-year-old recited his poem in Spanish first, and then translated it himself into English with the careful pride of a child who has understood something important about the world. Thomas watched this from the back of the room with his arms folded and his eyes bright, and Elvira watched him watching and felt the particular fullness of a person whose world is becoming more itself. January brought a cold snap that shut the mountain passes and slowed the mail, and made the 6 weeks between Thomas's visits feel like 12. She threw herself into the school with the energy of a woman sublimating various things into productive purpose, and expanded the reading list, organized a lending library of her own books, and petitioned the town council for a second stove, which they provided after the third petition, which was progress. His January letter was the longest, yet 12 pages that covered everything from the philosophical nature of loneliness to a detailed description of a spectacular lightning storm over the mountains east of Dry Creek, to a careful and entirely earnest outline of his finances, which he had apparently decided she should know about, including the value of the trading post, the terms of his lease on the land it occupied, his savings with the bank in Albuquerque, and his long-term intention to expand the building. She read the financial section twice, not because she was calculating, she was not that kind of person, but because the gesture itself moved her. He was not asking for her approval of his circumstances. He was showing her, with characteristic Thomas Ellsworth directness, that he had thought about a future that included her, and that he wanted her to see it clearly before she chose it. She wrote back 15 pages. He arrived in February with the grain sale and the particular look of a man who had made a decision, which she recognized by now. They had supper with the Pruitts on Friday evening, and on Saturday morning he came to the school while she was setting up for the week and asked if she would walk with him. They walked south out of town to where the land opened up and the scrub grass was just beginning to show the first pale green of the early spring. The sky was enormous and pale blue with high clouds moving fast in the south wind. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and he was not wearing his hat, which he never did in moments that mattered to him, she had noticed, as though he wanted nothing between him and the thing he was attending to. "I love you," he said. "I have told you that, and I am telling you again because it seems like the kind of thing that improves with repetition." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Elvira. To come to Dry Creek and be my wife and run the school if there isn't one there already, and help me run the store and sit on the porch and watch terrible sunsets and argue about books and do all the rest of it for the rest of our lives." She looked at him for a moment, this careful, honest, sun-weathered, decent man who had pulled her out of the road with such perfect matter-of-factness, who had held a stranger's baby on a stagecoach and put the alphabet in 2 languages, and agreed about the children of the Mexican workers and written to her across 40 miles of scrubland for 4 months without once being anything other than exactly himself. "Yes," she said. "Thomas, yes." He exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for 4 months, and then he stepped forward and put his arms around her, and she went into them, and it was, she thought briefly, before she stopped thinking about it, everything that Catherine had meant. Lit up. Thoroughly and completely lit up. He had a ring, which he produced from his vest pocket, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, deep red as a New Mexico canyon wall. He had gotten it from the jeweler in Albuquerque, he said, in January, because he was not a man who left things to chance once he was certain. She laughed at this and held out her hand, and he put it on her finger, and they stood in the February wind with the pale spring grass around them, and she felt the last of the hollowness from the hard year fill in, slowly and completely, like water rising to level. They were married in April, in the Millhaven church that had been completed in March with the same urgency the courthouse was getting, as though Millhaven was discovering all at once that it wanted to be a real town. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Aldous Price, who was not the nervous preacher from the stagecoach. That man had gotten off 2 stops before Millhaven, but a solid, warm-voiced man who had been in the territory long enough to be seasoned by it. Catherine stood up with Elvira and Will stood up with Thomas, because that was how the four of them had become in the preceding months, a natural unit, four people who fit together by circumstance and then by choice. Mrs. Delgado came from Dry Creek Station, which surprised Elvira and moved her almost to tears. Pedro came with her, now 15 and considerably taller, in a pressed shirt that he had clearly taken enormous trouble with. Marta from the stagecoach was not there because Elvira did not know her surname or her destination, but she thought of her briefly during the ceremony, the solidarity of the shared coach, the sleeping infant, the small kindness of Spanish offered without being asked. Thomas's mother, Margaret Ellsworth, had written from Nashville to say she could not make the journey, but that she had heard enough in her son's letters about this woman to know the choice was a fine one, which Elvira considered the best possible wedding gift from a woman she had not yet met. After the ceremony, the Prouts threw a supper that included most of the town, because Will Prout believed in the social utility of feeding people generously. There was dancing on the street outside in the warm April evening. Thomas danced with her twice, which was proper, and then once more after that, which was less proper and entirely worth it. He was not a graceful dancer. He was too serious about getting the steps right, which made him, paradoxically, charming, and she found she loved him more for the slightly furrow-browed concentration he brought to a waltz. They traveled back to Dry Creek in Thomas's wagon the following morning, with the sun coming up orange over the eastern mountains and the whole road empty in theirs. Elvira had said her goodbyes to Catherine the night before, a real goodbye, because Millhaven was 40 miles away, and the road was not always easy and lives had a way of filling up. "You'll come back," Catherine had said, with the compressed ferocity of a woman who has decided to believe it so completely that it doesn't require sentiment. Often, Elvira had promised, "And you'll come to us." The trading post at Dry Creek Station was larger than she remembered and smaller than it was going to be, because Thomas had drawn up plans over the winter to add a wing on the eastern side for a proper dry goods section. He showed her the plans the first morning, spreading them on the counter with the unaffected pride of a man who had built something and wanted it seen clearly. She studied them seriously, made 2 suggestions, one about the window placement for light and one about a small side room that would make an excellent combined office and reading room, and he considered both and accepted both. "You're going to be very useful," he said. "I intend to be," she said. Mrs. Delgado, who had apparently decided to extend her investment in this marriage, appeared at the back door that first morning with a covered pot of pozole and a look that suggested she would be keeping a proprietary interest in how things went. Rosa was with her, now 18, and with a particular brightness in her eyes when she looked at anything that suggested she was at the beginning of her own story, which made Elvira feel a warm, protective tenderness. "Is there a school here?" Elvira asked Thomas that afternoon, standing outside the trading post and looking down the small collection of buildings that made up Dry Creek Station. "There isn't," he said. "There should be," she said. "There should be," he agreed, and handed her the coffee cup he had brought out from inside with the easy familiarity of 2 people who have been having this kind of conversation for years, except that they had been married for 48 hours, and were still finding the particular miracle of chosen ordinariness. The handing over of coffee cups, the planning at shared counters wholly extraordinary. She began organizing a school in June. There was a room in an empty building at the end of the settlement that the owner, a land speculator from Denver who never came through more than twice a year, agreed to let for a nominal fee after a letter from Elvira that Thomas later described as the most polite piece of writing he had ever read that still somehow managed to convey exactly 0 interest in a different answer. By September, 1 year after she had hit the road out of that stagecoach, Elvira had 11 students in the Dry Creek School, a chalkboard with the alphabet in 3 languages. She had been learning Navajo phrases from a woman named Serafina who lived 2 miles out and was generous enough to teach. and a roster that included the children of the Anglo ranchers and the Mexican workers and 2 Navajo children whose family had, cautiously and then with increasing confidence, accepted that this teacher meant what she said about welcome. It was not always easy. There were people in the territory who objected to what she was doing, some loudly and some in the sideways manner of people who want a thing to fail without being held responsible for wishing it. A man named Harwell, who ranched to the south and considered himself a significant figure in the area, told Thomas at the store one afternoon that he thought the school's arrangement was irregular and unsuitable. Thomas looked at Harwell for a moment with that particular steady quality that was not quite a wall and not quite an invitation. "My wife's school," Thomas said, "is entirely regular and entirely suitable. And I would be careful, Harwell, about opinions on the subject of who is and is not welcome in this community, because I suspect the community's opinion is larger than yours." Harwell left without purchasing anything. Thomas told Elvira about it that evening at supper, which she appreciated. She had always wanted a partner who treated her as equal to her own battles. She thanked him for it and also told him that she could handle Harwell herself if it came to that, which he acknowledged with a nod that said yes, he knew, and he had no doubt of it, and yet. She understood the yet. She felt it the same way about him, the particular care of someone you love being in the world without you watching every moment. That was the private economy of being married to a person. She was discovering the small continuous accounting of what they needed and what you could give and what they could give you, and what the sum of all of it was worth. The sum was considerable. In the spring of 1875, Elvira discovered she was expecting their first child, which she told Thomas on a Sunday morning with the particular directness she brought to everything she said, looking up from the kitchen table where she had been working on lesson plans and saying simply, "I believe we're going to have a child." Thomas had gone very still for a moment, in the way of a man absorbing something large. Then the expression on his face had opened into something she had only seen in its fullest form twice before, once on the ridge in November with the Golden Valley below them, and once on the morning she had walked out of the church in Millhaven in her cream dress with garnet earrings that matched her ring. "When?" he asked. "October, I think," she said. He had come around the table and taken her face in both hands with the peculiar gentleness of a man who is usually gentle, but is now more so, and kissed her forehead and then her lips, and then held her for a long, quiet moment against his chest, while the morning light came through the kitchen window and Mrs. Delgado clanged something in her adjacent kitchen, as if to register that she had not heard anything but was pleased. She wrote to Catherine immediately, and Catherine's reply arrived 9 days later and contained 3 exclamation points, which was more than Catherine Prout had probably used in the preceding decade combined. She taught school through July, when the August heat and a particular exhaustion that she had been warned about but had underestimated made her accept the temporary replacement of a young man named Mr. Foster, who had come west from Virginia, and turned out to be an adequate teacher, with a respect for her curriculum that she had required as a condition of the arrangement. The boy was born in October, early on a Wednesday morning, in the bedroom above the trading post with the midwife from the settlement and Mrs. Delgado present, and Thomas visible through the cracked bedroom door for most of the night. In the store, doing inventory at 2 in the morning in what Elvira recognized as his particular version of being unable to sit still. They named him James Daniel Ellsworth James for Thomas's father, Daniel for hers. It was Thomas who suggested Daniel, which made Elvira understand again the depth of his particular quality of love, the generosity and honesty of it, that he would give that name willingly. James was a solid, dark-eyed baby who looked like his father and frowned like his mother, which Mrs. Delgado considered the ideal combination and said so at length. He also appeared to have opinions about things from a very early age, which Elvira found purely delightful and Thomas found slightly alarming. "He's 6 weeks old and he's already arguing," Thomas said one evening, watching James demonstrate his dissatisfaction with a blanket. "He's my son," Elvira said. Thomas considered this. "That explains it entirely," he said, and kissed her temple. She went back to the school in January, carrying James in the front pack that Seraphina had shown her how to make from a length of woven cloth, and her students accepted this development with the matter-of-factness of children, several of whom were accustomed to babies being present in the spaces where adults worked, and two of whom immediately became extremely invested in James's welfare and took turns making faces at him during reading lessons. The school grew. By 1876, there were 18 students and a second teacher. She had written to a normal school in Missouri and found a young woman named Miss Harriet Cole, who arrived in April with 2 trunks and a determination that Elvira found immediately recognizable and admirable. Harriet was 22 and had never been west of St. Louis, and stood in the middle of the dusty main street of Dry Creek Station on the day she arrived and looked around with the expression of a person confronting a thing much larger than they had anticipated. "It's extraordinary," Harriet said. "It is," Elvira agreed. "Come inside. I'll make tea and tell you everything about the school." Harriet was, within a month, indispensable, and within 6 was half in love with Pedro, who was 17 and growing into a young man of impressive solidity, and who spent a great deal of time finding reasons to be near the school. Elvira watched this developing situation with affectionate amusement, said nothing, mentioned it to Thomas, and was told that Thomas had noticed it in January and had been equally amused and equally silent. "Should we say something?" Elvira asked. "About what?" Thomas said. "About the fact that they are very clearly, they're fine," Thomas said. "People figure things out." She thought about that. "Like you figured out that I needed help in the road," she said. He looked at her with that expression, the deep, steady gray eyes, and said, "Something like that." The centennial year of 1876 was a year of changes across the territory, much of it not good. The pressure on the Navajo and Apache peoples continued in ways that Elvira found herself spending considerable energy in her classroom trying to address honestly, in the manner of a teacher who believes that a child who understands the world clearly is better equipped to be good in it than a child who has been fed a comfortable story. This was not universally appreciated. Harwell reappeared twice. Elvira dealt with him the second time personally in the doorway of the school, in a conversation that Thomas later said he would have very much liked to witness. "What did you say to him?" Thomas asked that evening. "I told him that his opinions about the school's curriculum were as welcome as they were accurate, which is to say not at all, and that if his children were in my school, which they were not, as he preferred to send them to the county school 20 miles away, he would have a standing to object to methods, but as they were not, his interest in my classroom was roughly equivalent to my interest in his opinions about it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "And then?" "And then he left," Elvira said. "People who deal in intimidation are frequently surprised when the person they're intimidating has already done a thorough accounting of exactly what they can and cannot do." Thomas laughed the low, genuine laugh that she had loved since the first time she heard it in the Trading Post. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said, "you are a remarkable woman." "I know," she said comfortably, and handed him his coffee. The Trading Post expanded in 1877, as Thomas had planned. The new wing was built by a team of 3 men from the settlement, and one of Thomas's ranch suppliers, who turned out to have been a carpenter before he was a rancher, and who brought the work in under budget and slightly ahead of schedule. The reading room, Elvira's suggestion, became real. A small, bright room with 2 chairs and shelves that grew over the following years into a modest but genuine library, stocked partly from Thomas's own books and partly from a donation campaign that Elvira organized with characteristic thoroughness. People who passed through the Trading Post, cowboys on the trail, merchants, the occasional traveler from back east who was going somewhere farther west, and stopped to rest, often spent an hour in the reading room before continuing, which Elvira found quietly perfect. A room with books in it was a room that was doing something important regardless of who was in it. In 1878, their second child arrived, a girl they named Margaret, for Thomas's mother in Nashville, who had finally made the long journey west the previous autumn and spent 3 weeks in the spare room above the store. A small, bright-eyed woman in her 60s who had her son's steady quality and her own considerable brand of warmth. Margaret Ellsworth Sr. had arrived, looked at the trading post and the school and the reading room and the way her son and daughter-in-law talked to each other over the supper table, and said, quietly and with great satisfaction, that she believed she had done something right. The baby Margaret looked from her first day entirely like her father, the same gray eyes and the same slight frown of concentration, which Thomas found extremely funny and which his mother declared was the Ellsworth mark going back 3 generations. James was 3 and took to his sister with a proprietorial affection that was among the most purely charming things Elvira had ever seen. Serious-faced James, who had opinions about everything, standing over his baby sister's cradle with the expression of a small person who has decided this is now his responsibility, and he is adequate to it. Thomas watched this same scene one evening with his arm around Elvira's shoulders and said softly, "He's going to be all right, isn't he?" "He's going to be more than all right," Elvira said. "He's going to be the kind of man that people stand up a little straighter around." "Like his mother," Thomas said. She leaned into him. "I was going to say like his father." They stood like that for a while in the doorway of the children's room, with James sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the cradle saying things to his baby sister in a low, serious voice, as though briefing her on the details of the world she had entered, and the evening light coming through the window turning everything gold, and the desert evening settling its vast quiet over the scrubland and the mountains and the small settlement of Dry Creek Station, where 2 people had found each other because a stagecoach had kept going and a man on a porch had decided to watch. That was 1878, and the years continued to open outward from there, with the pleasant, purposeful fullness of a life being genuinely lived. Harriet Cole and Pedro Delgado, who had been dancing around each other since 1876, were married in the spring of 1879 in a ceremony in the courtyard of Mrs. Delgado's house, where the tomatoes grew and the chili peppers dried in long ropes on the wall, and the entire settlement came, which was considerably more people than had been there when Elvira arrived, because Dry Creek Station was growing, slowly and steadily, the way good things grow. Mrs. Delgado cried at the wedding, which she would have denied vigorously if pressed, and presented the couple with a quilt she had been making since approximately the previous October, which suggested she had formed a view on the situation somewhat before either of the principals had announced it. Thomas gave a brief and genuine toast that made Harriet laugh and Pedro stand 3 inches taller. Elvira, watching from beside the table with 2-year-old James on her hip and Margaret in Thomas's arms, thought about roads and stagecoaches, and the particular arithmetic of moments that don't seem significant until much later, when you can see how many other moments were waiting inside them. She had been thrown off a stagecoach for not having a fare on a September afternoon in 1873 on a red dirt road in New Mexico Territory. She had landed in the dust, gotten up, straightened her back and walked toward a trading post, and a man on a porch had watched and had said 2 words that were, in their way, the most important words anyone had ever said to her. Get back on. Not because she needed rescuing, though the hand was welcome. Not because she couldn't have managed alone, though the road was long. But because he had seen her, accurately and completely, in the moment she was living, and had decided that she deserved to keep going, and had found the plainest possible way to say so. In 1880, she wrote this down. She had begun keeping a journal the previous year, not from any grand literary ambition, but because she was a schoolteacher and schoolteachers generally believed in the importance of writing things down, and because she was finding that the accumulation of her life was worth accounting for. She wrote about the school and the students and the town and the desert and the books and the children and Thomas. And she wrote about the road outside Dry Creek in September of 1873 with the particular precision she brought to things that had mattered. She wrote, "He was a man who looked at a difficult situation and saw the simplest possible good thing to do, and then did it without ceremony. I have been watching him do this for 7 years, and it has not become less remarkable." Thomas found the journal on the kitchen table one morning. She had left it open by accident, and read those 2 sentences before he understood what he was looking at. He did not read further. He closed the journal and put it back and said nothing about it, and she found it moved and did not mention it either. And they went on with the morning in the comfortable, specific way of people who know each other's silences as well as their voices. The school at Dry Creek Station was recognized by the Territorial Education Board in 1881, which meant a small but real allocation of funds and the official designation of Elvira Ellsworth as its head teacher, a title that she accepted with suitable modesty and then proceeded to use with complete authority. The student roll had grown to 24. 2 of her earliest students, now young men of 16 and 17, were among the strongest readers in the territory, which she knew because she had helped prepare them for the territorial examination and watched them place in the top 10%. One of those young men, a quiet boy named Alejandro whose parents had moved from Chihuahua before his birth, came to her on the day the examination results arrived and said, with the careful dignity of a boy trying not to be overwhelmed by what he felt, "My mother wanted me to tell you that she thanks you." Elvira looked at him for a moment. "Tell your mother," she said, "that the thanks goes the other way." He looked confused. She explained, "Your mother trusted me with you. That's not a small thing to trust someone with. I'm grateful for it." He went away thinking about that, which was exactly what she had intended. Thomas was at the counter when she came back into the store, and he looked at her face and said, "Good news." "Alejandro Reyes placed 8th in the territory," she said. Thomas's face did the thing she loved, the opening up, the transformation. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He came around the counter and kissed her in the middle of the store, which Pedro, who was reorganizing the bulk goods in the new wing, pointedly did not notice, being at that particular stage of his own marriage where he had an excellent understanding of when to find something else to look at. In 1882, James turned 7 and began attending his mother's school, which he approached with the seriousness of a small person who has been waiting a long time for access to a large amount of information. He was immediately one of the best readers in his class and was careful enough about it not to be insufferable, which was a relief, though he did occasionally have to be reminded not to finish other children's sentences during the oral reading exercises. Margaret, at 4, had decided she was also attending school, a position she communicated to her father with such absolute confidence that Thomas had come to Elvira and said, "Your daughter has informed me she is going to school." "She's 4, Elvira said. "I know," Thomas said. "She knows, she finds it irrelevant." Margaret went to school, in the sense that she was present for the afternoon sessions when James attended, sitting in the corner with a slate of her own and doing whatever she decided the lesson required, which was different from what Elvira required but was, Elvira acknowledged privately to Thomas, usually at the same level as the older students. "She's going to be a great deal of work," Thomas said. "She's going to be wonderful," Elvira said. "Same thing," Thomas said. The years settled into a rhythm that was never static, the rhythm of a living place, of people growing and building and teaching and trading and finding each other, and arguing and reconciling and planting and harvesting, and watching the seasons go through their extraordinary performances over the New Mexico mountains. The reading room grew into something that people came from 20 miles to use, which had been Elvira's goal since she organized it, and which Thomas supported with the steady generosity that was his fundamental characteristic. Not just the money but the interest, the genuine curiosity about which books had arrived, and what the students were reading, and what Elvira thought about what she was reading. They argued about books with the pleasure of 2 people who are arguing for the joy of it, who enjoy each other's thinking even when they disagree. They argued about Dickens, about history, about the particular questions of the territory and the West and the larger country that was still, in 1883, working out what it meant to be itself. These conversations happened at the supper table and on the porch in the evenings, and in the store when business was slow, and in the wagon on the road to Millhaven when they made the quarterly visit to Catherine and Will, who were aging gracefully and producing excellent opinions and enormous suppers. Thomas's mother made a second visit in 1883, a longer one, staying for the whole summer, and something happened that visit which Elvira would think about for years afterward. She came in from the school one afternoon to find Thomas and his mother sitting on the porch, not talking, just sitting in the way of people who are entirely comfortable in each other's company, and the look on Thomas's face was one she recognized from her own private moments, the look of a person who has ended up somewhere better than they had known to aim for. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, and felt the particular gift of seeing happiness clearly from the outside. Margaret Ellsworth Sr. left in September, pressing both of Elvira's hands in hers at the stage station and saying, "Take care of him. Not that he needs it, but take care of him anyway." "I will," Elvira said. "You raised him very well." The older woman shook her head slightly. "He raised himself mostly," she said. "I just made sure he knew the difference between what matters and what doesn't." She paused. "You know it too. I noticed that about you the moment I arrived." They embraced, and the stage left, and Thomas put his arm around Elvira's shoulders, and they walked back through the main street of Dry Creek Station, which had 3 more buildings now than when Elvira had first walked it in 1873, and a proper well at the center, and the school at the far end with its windows bright in the afternoon light, and it felt, as it always felt, like theirs. Not because they owned it, but because they had put themselves into it, the way people do in the places where they are genuinely alive. In 1884, their 3rd child arrived, a boy they named Robert, for reasons that were partly Thomas's grandmother's family and partly because they liked it, which Elvira considered sufficient justification. Robert was from his first weeks an entirely different proposition from his siblings. Where James was serious and Margaret was fierce, Robert was sunny and social, and appeared to consider every person he encountered a personal acquaintance awaiting introduction. Thomas held him in the store on the first afternoon Elvira brought him down from the bedroom and looked at his wide-eyed, sociable expression with mild bewilderment. "He's very enthusiastic," Thomas said. "He's going to be the one people talk to at parties," Elvira said. "We don't have parties," Thomas said. "We will now," Elvira said with great confidence and was correct. James, at 9, was the responsible elder sibling, explaining the world to Robert with the same tone he had used on Margaret in the cradle, as though the briefing were never fully complete. Margaret, at 6, had opinions about Robert's name, his sleeping schedule, and the color of his blankets, all of which she communicated at length, and had appointed herself his co-supervisor alongside James, which Robert seemed to find perfectly satisfactory. The family occupied the upstairs of the trading post now. Thomas had expanded it properly in 1881 to accommodate the 2nd bedroom and a real sitting room, and the sounds of it were the sounds Elvira went to sleep to every night. The children's voices, Thomas's voice, the wind over the scrubland, the occasional late customer's bell below, the coyotes calling across the dark from ridge to ridge. She was 37 years old in 1884, and she had been married for 11 years, and the life she had was nothing like what she had imagined from St. Louis or Missouri, or even from the red dirt road in September of 1873, and it was better than any of those imaginings in ways she could not have described then, because she had not known what she did not know. She had not known what it was to have a partner who was genuinely her equal in every matter she found important. She had not known what it was to have work that was genuinely hers and genuinely meaningful. She had not known what it was to watch children. Her own and other people's grow from small, puzzled persons into larger, clearer ones, carrying things she had taught them into lives she would not fully see. She thought sometimes about the version of herself who had been pitched off the stagecoach into the road dusty and broke and alone, and not quite ready to acknowledge how frightened she was, and felt an immense tenderness for that person. She had been right about one thing, that woman in the road. She needed to go forward. She had simply not known in that moment that forward included a trading post and a man on a porch and a life that would turn out to contain everything she had not thought to want. Thomas found her on the porch one late October evening in that year of 1884, sitting in the rocking chair with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, looking at the road in the last light. He came out and sat in the chair beside her and said nothing for a while. "What are you thinking about?" he said eventually. 11 years ago today," she said, "give or take a week." He was quiet. "I was sitting in this exact road," she said, "right out there, more or less." He looked at the road. "I know," he said. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "When you were standing there watching?" He considered this for a long moment. "I was thinking that the driver was a fool," he said, "and that the woman who'd just gotten off his coach looked like she had more going on inside her than the whole rest of that sorry situation combined." She laughed softly. "And then you said get back on." "And then I said get back on," he agreed. She reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took his hand, and he held hers with the same steadiness he had held it on the ridge in November of 1873, on the red sandstone with the golden valley below, when she had told him she had taken off her ring, and he had not made it into more than it was and not made it into less. "Thomas," she said. "Elvira," he said. "I'm glad you were standing on that porch," she said. He lifted her hand and kissed it, the same gesture as the ridge, and looked at her with the deep, steady, unhurried attention that was the most characteristic thing about him. The quality that had meant from the very first moment that he looked at what was actually there and responded to it honestly, without pretense or deflection. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The sun went down over the New Mexico scrubland in all its excessive, magnificent orange and violet and gold, the mountains going blue and then purple and then deep, and the first stars came out over the ridge to the east, and below the porch the road lay pale and empty in the gathering dark, the same road it had always been, that ran between all the places a person could come from and all the places a person could go. And two people sat in rocking chairs holding hands and watched the sky go through its daily performance of the extraordinary, and were entirely, completely home. Inside, James was reading to Robert from a book about explorers, in the authoritative tone of a 9-year-old who considers himself the appropriate authority on all things. Margaret was drawing something on her slate with the focused intensity she brought to all projects, occasionally directing corrections to James's reading that were, Thomas whispered to Elvira, probably accurate. Mrs. Delgado's kitchen window was lit in the adobe house across the courtyard, and the smell of something wonderful came across the evening air, and Pedro's voice could be heard calling something to Harriet from the direction of the store's new wing, where he had been doing an inventory count. This was Dry Creek Station on an October evening in 1884, and it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary, and it was exactly the life that had been waiting in the road 11 years ago, when a woman had been thrown from a stagecoach for not having a fare and had stood up and straightened her spine, and a man on a porch had watched and had known with the quiet, certain knowledge of a person who sees clearly, that the right thing to do was exactly and simply this: say get back on, mean it, and then be there for the rest of it.